Hello, everyone. My name is Doc, and welcome to another Temporary Worlds Let's Read. Today, we're reading Stephen Conway's book chapter on the Magic Circle and its relationship to the popular football or soccer game franchise, FIFA. This book chapter is part of an edited volume called How to Play Video Games, edited by Matthew Thomas Payne and Nina B. Huntman. It's a really fantastic resource for getting started with thinking about games and play, and even for having a great resource for teaching. So keep it in mind, and we'll certainly return to it quite often. So to give you a sense of what this book chapter is about, Stephen Conway is working through the theories of Johann Huizinga, or Huizinga, as he kindly writes here for us. Johann Huizinga, who's a Dutch historian from the early 20th century, who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, Man of Play, in 1938. And essentially, what he does in this chapter can be broken up into about three sections, right? So in this first section, which I've marked here, he is articulating what Huizinga's theory of play and games really is. And so we'll work through this in just a second, but you can see it's about 3 pages there. And then in the second section of this chapter, Conway is sort of comparing and contrasting Huizinga's theory of play with other theories of play, and is really making the case that Huizinga is more articulating a theory of games and rules, less than a theory of free or experimental play. And so that's the work of this second section. And the third section, Conway brings it back to computer games and sort of asks what might Huizinga's theory look like in contemporary computer game culture, and does so by thinking through the FIFA series. And at the end, we'll touch on some of the main points in here, but that's just the main 3 sections that structure this book chapter. So beginning with the first section, I think Conway does a great job of identifying some of the key aspects of Huizinga's theory of play that he articulates in Homo Ludens. One of those very important things is that Huizinga believes that play is meaningful. He quotes Huizinga here, and Huizinga is writing, "It is a significant function, play. All play means something." And Conway identifies Huizinga as an idealist, someone who thinks of play as something that is primarily in the mind and not material or in the body. And this is one really essential aspect of Huizinga's theory. Another essential aspect of Huizinga's theory that Conway touches on is this idea, again, of the title here would suggest a sort of space, a magic circle, right? Huizinga insists that wherever play happens, it happens in some special place that is bounded. And this quote here is one of the more famous quotes from Homo Ludens, and there's a few parts that are certainly worth reading here. Huizinga writes, "All play moves and has its being within a playground, marked off beforehand either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be distinguished from the playground." He concludes, "All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart." So what I think is really important about this quote to put into conversation with this theory is that there's something really important at a deep cultural level, much more so than we might normally accord to the playing of, say, computer games. But again, Huizinga's theory developed in this early 20th century context, and with his background as a historian and anthropologist, this is his approach and his understanding of what play might be. Another essential aspect that Conway highlights of Huizinga's theory is this idea that play creates order. There's another great quote here that's worth reading. Huizinga writes that, "Inside the playground, an absolute and peculiar order reigns. Play creates order, is order. Into an imperfect world and into the confusion of life, it brings a temporary, a limited perfection." And Conway very, very rightly remarks here that this makes play seem like something that is vacuum sealed away from the rest of the world. This is really essential to Huizinga's theory of play and the concept of the magic circle, that it is a special, not only is it a special place that has its own important rules, but it actually brings about an order which doesn't exist in our normal everyday life, and that is part of what makes play special. And then, of course, Conway also makes the important distinction here that for Huizinga, really mundane things become really important and really special. They are imbued with an extraordinary significance during the act of play. And this is because, and this is one of the final points I want to touch on for this first section, for Huizinga, to play is to pledge oneself to an illusion. A leap of faith is required. One acts as if things specified by the game rules have value, without acknowledging the fantasy implied by the as if. There is this sort of intensity, this buy-in, this desire to treat play as something very serious and very real, and to choose that freely, right? This is essential for Huizinga, and Conway's right to point this out, that for Huizinga, there's this moment of choosing to adopt, to voluntarily commit oneself. The freedom to choose, to voluntarily commit oneself to the fantasy, the as if, is the feeling of freedom on his understanding of play, of committing to the game entirely. And anyone who fails to do this, who is disinterested or ignores the rules or doesn't treat them very seriously, essentially fails to become a player. Moving on to section 2, Conway brings Huizinga into conversation with another thinker about play and sort of starts to say, okay, what exactly is Huizinga describing? Is he describing play, or is he describing perhaps rules and a game? And essentially, Conway makes the argument that indeed, we would better think of Huizinga's theory as a theory about rules and games rather than play. And by putting Roger Caillois on the table for us here, Conway puts Huizinga into conversation with another theorist of play that he's often paired with. And I think the essential point to remember here comes in this quote right here, which I'll just read aloud. Stated bluntly, game does not care much about play, nor does play about game, if we follow Huizinga's definition. This is because the essence of a game is rules, and rules are, as a rule, always more concerned with adherence and procedure than the interpretation and style, which is the player's share of the circle. A game is binary, it is black and white. On the other hand, play is spectral, with lots of gray between perfect whites and the deepest blacks. This is a really interesting and essential point from this particular piece of writing, and you'll encounter this idea of the distinction between play and games quite often in many game studies texts. The question about whether or not these things are in opposition to each other. Obviously, I want to be careful to say here, Conway is not suggesting that games and play constitute a binary where they are opposites, only that they are very different, and that he's doing some work here to highlight that difference. So that's all I want to touch on from this second section. In the third section, I also just want to briefly touch on a couple points of Conway's interpretation of FIFA and his understanding, bringing Huizinga into the 21st century and thinking, okay, what does the magic circle do in a sort of computer game context? Conway goes through a bit of a reading of FIFA, a bit of an interpretation of FIFA, and argues that in the modern FIFA series, numbers are immensely important to the series, not simply in terms of what happens behind the scenes, but ultimately for the player experience as well. So for anyone who's played FIFA, you'll know that characters have different power, speed, physicality, and stamina abilities, and that this stuff is really important when you're putting together a team. And ultimately, towards the end of this book chapter, Conway puts something really important on the table, which is that because FIFA, with its hyper-rational and sort of mathematical approach to representing soccer, because it has that approach, it is actually very much resonating with other dominant cultural values in Western society. Hyper-rationality, masculinity being another important thing, and that an aspect of the magic circle that Huizinga perhaps doesn't account for or doesn't think of, but which Conway wants to draw our attention to, is that the magic of the magic circle draws in a large extent, or at least to some extent, from its resonance with broader cultural values. And this is really Conway stepping beyond Huizinga's theory to say it's very possible that the idea that games are this vacuum-sealed phenomenon maybe just doesn't hold up for many of our experiences of play. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope it got you thinking about play and games in a different way, and I hope it encouraged you to read more. Thanks so much for watching.